Right now, Iran is a country most people only know through headlines. But rewind exactly 100 years, and you'd find a nation in the middle of one of the most dramatic transformations in its 2,500-year history: a fading royal dynasty collapsing, a soldier from nowhere rising to the throne, and an entire country being dragged into the modern age almost overnight. This is the story of Persia 100 years ago, and the fall of the Qajar dynasty. By the early 1920s, Persia, what we now call Iran, was in serious trouble. For decades, the ruling Qajar dynasty had been slowly losing its grip on the country. Weak, often absent kings had drained the treasury, handed out generous deals to foreign powers in exchange for personal payoffs, and left the government nearly powerless. Britain and Russia had spent years carving out their own spheres of influence across Persian territory, treating parts of the country almost like their own backyard. By the time the First World War ended, Persia was fractured, regional warlords controlled entire provinces, tribes rebelled against the central government, and foreign troops still lingered on Persian soil. The monarchy that was supposed to hold the country together barely had any real power left at all. Into this chaos stepped a man named Reza Khan. He wasn't born into wealth or nobility. He came from a modest military family and rose up entirely through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade, a disciplined military unit originally trained with Russian help. Reza Khan was tough, ambitious, and knew exactly how to make himself useful to whoever held power. In February of 1921, he led a coup alongside a political ally, seizing control of Tehran. Within just a couple of years, he wasn't just a military commander anymore. He had made himself Minister of War, then Prime Minister, systematically pulling every armed group in the country under his personal control, until his was the only military force that actually mattered in Persia. Meanwhile, the last Qajar king, Ahmad Shah, was becoming almost a ghost in his own country. He was often described as more interested in his health and his travels than in actually ruling. In 1923, he left for a trip to Europe, and he would never set foot in Persia again. With the king gone, and Reza Khan controlling the only functioning army in the country, the writing was already on the wall. On the 31st of October 1925, the Persian parliament, the Majlis, formally voted to remove the Qajar dynasty from power altogether. It wasn't unanimous. A small number of politicians, including a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, who would later become famous in his own right, warned that concentrating this much power in one man's hands was dangerous for the country's future. But those warnings were ignored. Just weeks later, in December of 1925, a specially arranged assembly declared Reza Khan the new monarch, and he took on a new name, Reza Shah Pahlavi. The name Pahlavi wasn't chosen by accident. It was a deliberate callback to ancient pre-Islamic Persia, a way of linking this brand new dynasty to the glory of Persia's distant past. In the spring of 1926, Reza Shah held his coronation inside Tehran's Golistan Palace. With his own hands, he lifted the newly made crown and placed it on his own head, sitting down on the marble throne that generations of Persian kings had once used. After more than a century of Qajar rule, Persia had an entirely new dynasty and an entirely new direction. So what did daily life actually look like for ordinary Persians during this turbulent transition? For most people living outside the capital, life hadn't changed much in generations. The vast majority of the population were farmers and villagers, living in mud brick homes, following the same agricultural rhythms their families had followed for centuries. Roads outside the major cities were often little more than dirt tracks, and entire regions could feel completely cut off from the central government in Tehran. Tribal identity still mattered enormously in many parts of the country. People felt far more loyalty to their tribal leaders than to any king sitting on a throne hundreds of miles away. In Tehran itself, though, change was already beginning to creep in. The city had electric streetlights along its major roads, a handful of automobiles sharing the streets with horse carts and camels, and the very first stirrings of a modern bureaucracy and postal service. Bazaars remained the heartbeat of every Persian city, bustling covered marketplaces, packed with merchants selling carpets, spices, textiles, and metalwork, largely unchanged for centuries. Once Reza Shah took the throne, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. He was obsessed with modernizing and centralizing the country, often looking directly at what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was doing next door in Turkey and trying to follow a similar path. He built Iran's first major railway network, pushed for new roads connecting isolated provinces to the capital, and established the country's first modern university in Tehran. Schools modeled on European systems began opening across the country, and for the first time, education started to become more available to ordinary Persian families, not just the wealthy elite. Reza Shah also pursued sweeping and often controversial social reforms. He pushed hard to reduce the power of tribal leaders and forced many nomadic groups to settle permanently, sometimes through harsh and violent measures. He required men across the country to wear Western-style clothing instead of traditional dress. And in 1936, he issued an order banning women from wearing the traditional veil in public, a policy that many families experienced as invasive and deeply unwelcome, even as the government presented it as progress. His new national army was built specifically to make sure no one could ever challenge his authority, the way regional warlords had challenged the weak Qajar kings before him. In 1935, Reza Shah made one final symbolic move. He asked foreign countries to officially refer to the nation not as Persia, but as Iran, a name rooted in the country's own ancient heritage, rather than one given to it by outsiders. That single decision still shapes how the world refers to the country today. Looking back, this single decade completely rewired the country. A crumbling monarchy that had been propped up by foreign powers and undermined by its own weak leadership gave way to a centralized, modernizing, but also far more authoritarian state. Roads, schools, and railways connected a country that had once been fractured into isolated tribal regions. But that same modernization came at a real cost to personal freedom, tradition, and the voices of ordinary Persians who had very little say in how fast or in what direction their country was changing. So here's a question for you. Do you think Reza Shah's rapid modernization was worth the authoritarian control that came with it? Or should Persia have changed more slowly, on its own terms? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, subscribe for more next time. We're heading somewhere else entirely to see what life looked like exactly 100 years ago.